for the next hour or so, we will be talking intensively about the frontotemporal disorders. And this particular type of dementia is very complex. They're all very complex, but this one tends to have a lot more variances to this particular disorder. We have some understanding about, we know what causes it, certain types of proteins, but why those proteins become toxic and start to atrophy different parts of the brain, we don't know. Just like we don't know what actually causes or starts Alzheimer's disease and these other progressive dementias. We'll be talking intensively about understanding sort of the different variances of this disease. Like I said, they are pretty complex. And then we'll talk about treatment, how to best manage and treat the disease as well. Because that's important, you know, with all of these progressive dementias that we work with and that we cover, our big philosophy of care is how do we maintain the highest quality of life for those living with the disease and those that are caring for those persons living with the disease as well. While the researchers and scientists and doctors are looking for cures and preventions, which is incredibly important, we want to be able to live well with right now with the information that we have. And that is, how do we increase that quality of life? How do we maintain where somebody's at in their disease state for as long as we possibly can, and work with what abilities they still have left. And also on the care partner side, how do we manage the disease and taking care of ourselves as well? Because everybody is impacted by this disease. When there's one diagnosis, there's at least 2 or 3 people impacted immensely by the disease. Of course, the person with the diagnosis, but those that are immediately around them caring for them. So how do we do that? And how do we do that well, right? You know, here you were talking about dementia is that umbrella term. And there's several different types of progressive dementias underneath that umbrella term. And, you know, dementia really is a disease of the brain. The best definition I have ever heard for this, for dementia in general, is that somebody is going into brain failure. So with this, you know, somebody's going into brain failure, we know that it starts mild and it progressively gets worse over time. And as the disease changes, moves throughout the brain, we'll see different signs and symptoms and what that looks like. Frontotemporal dementia is commonly your 4th most common type of dementia. You have Alzheimer's disease as your most common type, and then we have vascular dementia, then Lewy body dementia, and then frontotemporal dementia as that 4th most common. Like I just mentioned earlier, frontotemporal dementia can have its own umbrella term with all the different variances that it has and the complexities of this particular dementia. And it really is, it's a group of disorders. It's a spectrum. You know, these group of disorders caused by progressive nerve cell loss. Again, the brain is going into failure. And it particularly happens in the frontal lobes of the brain. So that's where the fronto comes. And then the temporal lobes of the brain, a frontal lobe, temporal lobe, where we start to see the nerve cell damage and the shrinkage that happens in the brain. These neuron dies. In the frontal lobes, the temporal lobes, you see the shrinkage and you see the symptoms that come along with the changes that are happening in those areas of the brain. With these dementias, they do eventually progress through other areas of the brain, but these are typically where they start. And just like an Alzheimer's type dementia, it progresses. Again, it's progressive and it is a fatal diagnosis if they don't pass away from something else before. And we'll talk about what these symptoms look like because it's different than somebody having some short-term memory loss, which is what we commonly associate dementia with. That first warning sign, they're just not remembering the way they used to, or they can't hold on to new information. Frontotemporal dementia, this looks different because we don't see necessarily a memory loss warning sign at the beginning. What we see, because of the area of the brain it's starting in, either in the frontal lobe, we'll see some behavioral changes, or if it's in the temporal lobes, we'll see some language changes. Of course, we'll talk more about what that exactly looks like. But knowing that because this dementia is different, you're going to see different signs than what we typically associate an Alzheimer's type dementia with. So here is just a chart, and it's talking about the different variances of dementia. And today we're going to talk about a behavioral variant, a language variant, and a motor variant, which is not on this slide particularly, but the behavioral variant is the most common variant of a frontotemporal dementia. It accounts for about 50% of all the diagnoses of somebody that has a frontotemporal dementia. And then you'll have the aphasia diagnoses of the frontotemporal dementia. And there's a couple of different variations to this aphasia type. There's a progressive non-fluent and a semantic dementia. There's also a lopogenic dementia as well, associated with the language changes, which again, we're going to talk about more in depth. This is just another slide to help us understand how complex this particular type of dementia is, that the spectrum of disorders, the frontotemporal disorders that you have that behavioral variant, and we'll look at the symptoms with that, which is personality changes or personality decline, changes in their ability to control emotions and control impulses. Their social conduct is going to change, lack of insight. They don't understand how their changing in behaviors are affecting other people. And then we'll see those primary progressive aphasia, those language decline areas. And this is that semantic dementia where they just don't understand the words or the meaning of words, or they may not know what the names of things are anymore, but they're still able to have fluid speech. They may start repeating themselves, but it's a comprehension. They're not really understanding the meaning of words. So what they're trying to comprehend, but also the words they're trying to use as well. And then the non-fluent aphasia, and this is where we're having effortful speech, where we're trying to speak and say something, but they may not get it out. They may know up here what they want to say, it's just not able to come out. Or they don't know what an object is as well, and some word comprehension too. And then here on this slide, it has the behavioral variant, the language variants, but also those motor variances that we will see. And with some words that we might typically know this as is corticobasal syndrome, progressive supranuclear palsy, and there is a frontotemporal dementia or FTD with Parkinson's and an FTD with ALS. Again, we're going to talk more in depth about each one of those, but when we're talking about the frontotemporal dementias or disorders, the three main variants of it are the behavioral variant, a language variant or the primary progressive aphasia, and then the progressive motor variant or motor decline. And then there's several subsets to each one of those three types of frontotemporal dementia. And this helps us understand, I mentioned earlier there's a decline or a nerve cell damage in the frontal lobes, but in the temporal lobes as well. So behind our forehead is our frontal lobe. And you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen, the frontotemporal dementia, that frontal lobe, when it's dark, you have that dark blue or even those black spots. That means that there's no nerve cells there. So that's where parts of the brain are frankly missing. So those nerve cells have been damaged. They die and they shrink up and kind of wither away. So that's what those dark spots represent on this slide, and looking at the changes in somebody with Alzheimer's disease and frontotemporal dementia. So you can see that frontal lobe at the top of the slide there. That's the frontal lobe, right behind the forehead. And then you can see right behind that, maybe where your temples are and where your ears are at, those the temporal lobes, you can see those dark spots there. And this is somebody that's progressed far enough into the disease. They're in the later stages of the frontotemporal dementia, and you can see the changes that are just happening. That does look different from somebody with an Alzheimer's dementia. According to the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, the FTD is the second most common dementia in younger people. So we tend to see younger people diagnosed with the frontotemporal dementia, and this can be anybody in their 20s, 30s. We typically see it in their 40s and 50s and maybe young 60s. It says here 60% of people with FTD are between the ages of 45 and 64 years old. Life expectancy is 7 years. But this disease, just like all the other types of dementia, are very individualistic. Because there's so many variants, for one thing, variants to this dementia, but just how it affects somebody is so incredibly different as well. We're going to talk about what the symptoms look like, but how that really affects somebody. I'll share some stories of personal people that I've known, and then just some articles I've read and videos I've watched too, and what that looks like in somebody when we see these symptoms. All the disorders are progressive. And in the early stages, somebody might just have one symptom. So they might have a behavioral change, or they might starting to become socially inappropriate, or they're having a really harder time with their language and trying to get their words out. But we don't really see anything else. Just kind of one of those kind of one things that we're seeing that are uncharacteristic and a warning flag, right? But there's not something else there. As this disease progresses, then you will start to see more and more symptoms appear. There are no treatments for the disease. We'll talk about some medications and treatment options to help manage the disease, but nothing that can slow the progression or stop the progression or prevent it from happening. But they are working very hard on something like that, just like they are for all the other dementias. With frontotemporal dementia, this is, I would say, probably one of the most misdiagnosed dementias. For one reason is because it typically happens in people that are younger. It does happen more in men than it does women. Doesn't mean women can't get it, it's just 4 times more common in men. And when we're starting to see these changes in somebody that might be in their 40s or 50s, for instance, we don't typically go to somebody who has a dementia. Right. So we're looking at, when we're getting all these symptoms together and doctors and clinicians are looking at the symptoms that somebody is presenting with, they don't typically go to a dementia diagnosis. A lot of the times this disease is first diagnosed as probably a mental illness. That's fairly common that happens, particularly the behavioral variant of this, a mental illness. Well, that's a mental illness is different than dementia. So it can take several years to get this dementia accurately diagnosed in people because it happens in a younger age. We're not typically looking for dementia. And it's also hard to get people to go to the doctor, just like it is with other dementias, Alzheimer's disease as well. But people are more, I guess, maybe afraid to go to the doctor because it is, particularly the behavioral variant one, it might be a mental health issue, they think, as something as opposed to a dementia. So it's hard to pick up. And the first early signs can be subtle because it might just be that one little thing that seems really odd about our loved one or ourselves or whatever it may be, but we're not seeing other stuff until the disease progresses. There's an abnormal collection of certain proteins. There's a tau protein that we also see in Alzheimer's disease that starts to attack the nerve cells in the brain. There's a couple of other proteins that have been identified that we'll talk about a little bit later that starts to attack those nerve cells and cause the shrinkage inside the brain. It is say it's 2 to 10% of all dementias across the board, and there tends to be a strong familial history. They don't quite know why, or can't identify why that is, but there does about 50% of it does seem to come or stay in the family if it's already been introduced to a family. So this is just a short overview video about frontotemporal dementia.
Let's talk about frontotemporal dementia. It's a long term and a scary one, but it's important to understand what it really means. Let's break it down. Fronto and temporal refer to the parts of the brain affected by the disease, the frontal and temporal lobes. The frontal lobes are in charge of executive functions like planning, prioritizing, and multitasking. They also help you decide what's important in different social situations. For instance, it's your frontal lobes that enable you to follow directions in a recipe and to talk quietly in a library. The temporal lobes play a major role in language and emotions. They help you understand words and communicate. They also help you recognize objects and people and control your emotions and figure out what may be triggering them. Someone with damage to their temporal lobes may not understand that a hot stove is dangerous or why you're worried and upset when they try to touch it. The temporal lobes also manage memory storage. However, for most people living with frontotemporal dementia, or FTD for short, memory changes are not a major symptom. That's one of the many ways FTD is different from other common types of dementia like Alzheimer's disease. Here's how else they compare. FTD usually affects younger adults. It is the most common form of dementia in people under the age of 60. Symptoms of FTD usually start in people aged 45 to 64, but may also occur later in life. Also, FTD is less common than Alzheimer's, and much less is known about it. It is frequently misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's, depression, or a psychiatric illness. On average, it takes 3.6 years to get an accurate diagnosis. Unfortunately, there is no cure for Alzheimer's or FTD, but some treatments are beginning to emerge. That's why it's so important to take part in clinical research if you can. When it comes to FTD, like everything, knowledge is power. It is critical to get the right diagnosis. This will help avoid potentially dangerous medications you don't need and empower you and your care partners to prepare for the future. Learn more about dementia and get the support you need by calling 858-492-40.
That's a really good overview of what FTD, frontotemporal dementias, are. And I love how it highlights getting a good diagnosis for this, even though it can be, for lack of a better word, maddening to get a proper diagnosis because it can take so long. You want to make sure you're having on the right treatment path and you understand the disease that everybody's impacted by and everybody's living with. Because there are ways, like I mentioned earlier, to have a high quality of life. So you may have heard there's different type names for FTD or the frontotemporal dementia. The behavioral variant you can see here, it's BVFTD. It's the most common type of the frontotemporal disorders. And then it used to be named, or the original name was named Pick's disease, if you have heard of that. They've really are now using or calling it an FTD disorder and what variant that you have as opposed to Pick's disease. But it was named after Dr. Pick, who first described the persons with these distinct symptoms. And now they are starting to show that they're what you call Pick bodies or certain proteins that you can see in the picture here in somebody's brain that builds up. Not everybody has these Pick bodies in their brains with the behavioral variant of a dementia, but you do see them, they are fairly common. And then the other name for it is frontotemporal lobar degeneration. And these are just another names because you're starting to see the degeneration in the frontal lobes and the temporal lobes as well in somebody with these diseases. So symptoms that we can see. And what symptoms you're going to first see in somebody with a frontotemporal disorder or dementia depends on what part of the brain is being damaged first, just like it is with every other type of dementia, like Alzheimer's disease. We know the hippocampus part of the brain is the first part to be damaged with Alzheimer's disease. So you see that symptom of short-term memory loss, because that's the part of the brain that houses our short-term memory loss, or our short-term memories and ability to form new memories. So with the frontotemporal dementia, it depends on where in the brain is the damage occurring. The frontal lobes, you're going to see more behavioral changes. The temporal lobes, you'll see more language changes. And then for the motor part of it, it happens more in the temporal lobes, but kind of the brainstem as well. But what you can see is inappropriate social behaviors that are just different from somebody's normal behaviors. There was a gentleman I read about that he was an artist. That was his profession. And he was actually in his 40s and really getting into his career, making a name for himself. but he was starting to behave socially inappropriate in galleries and with his fellow artists, saying sexual comments that he never would have, off-color jokes, laughing when it was inappropriate to laugh. And then also starting to not being predatorily aggressive, but maybe go around and with his female artist friends, he would kiss them on the forehead or give them a hug just kind of out of nowhere. And it's just really uncharacteristic and a little bit, inappropriate and awkward. So they started to see these subtle changes in him. And eventually things started to get worse and he got an accurate diagnosis. You can see people shouting loudly in public, laughing inappropriately, having a hard time reading other people's social signs. So when other people become awkward around you, or maybe they're trying to distance themselves, somebody with a frontotemporal disorder may not recognize that, probably don't. And that has a lot to do with this frontal lobe. This is where we are able to see it from somebody else's perspective. It's housed up here. And if that part of the brain's being damaged, then we're having a hard time seeing from somebody else's perspective or seeing how our behaviors are really influencing those around us. Difficulty making decisions is that it's executive functioning up there or following familiar tasks that we used to do. Can ignore important aspects of a situation, can focus on insignificant details, having trouble managing those finances or following a recipe or anything like that. Can engage in purposeless activities or it's that insignificant detail of something. It can also look like an obsessive compulsive disorder. I have seen this in people where they are obsessive about one particular thing. And this person that I saw, it was on the dinner table. They were very obsessive about making sure the napkin was folded the right way. And they could spend 30 minutes making sure that napkin was folded the right way while everybody else was eating their dinner. Their dinner was getting cold, tried to get their attention to it, but they were obsessed by this has to be right before I can move on to something else. And that was a symptom for that particular individual. And so language, having a hard time linking words to form sentences. They may have words, but they may not make a sentence that makes sense or makes a full sentence. Having a hard time understanding words. And again, this is that semantic dementia, just the understanding of words that either I'm hearing or words that I'm trying to use. Maybe a hard time reading. And then writing can change to where they might be able to write out a short word like all, A-L-L, or they cannot write out a short word like all, and one that we use all the time, the, it, something like that. But they can write alligator or words that we don't use all the time, like symptoms. They can use those and write those out very well. But those ones that we use every day, they're having a harder and harder time with. And then difficulty with motor decline, motor movement disorders. And this can be anywhere from posture, how they're holding themselves up, and it just looks awkward, like they're like they bend at the waist, and they stand just half bent a little bit a lot of times, or they can have a sway back and they're standing like this. This is their posture. And it's a natural thing to them. They can also be very stiff in their movements. Again, we'll talk about FTD with Parkinson's and what that looks like. Balance can come off, or they can just become very weak. Their muscles become very weak and they're not able to use them. Of course, judgment and social behaviors are affected. The social inappropriateness, it can typically be seen a lot of being sexually inappropriate. And what happens, and I heard a gentleman explain it, and he was diagnosed with FTD, and he was very positive about it. He said, one of the good things about it is I have absolutely lost my filter. So now people know what I'm really thinking about them. He was very coherent in his speech and being able to express himself, but he was also aware that he did not have a filter, and that has gotten him into some sticky spots. He even shared a story where it got him to a sticky spot with a police officer. And it's not that he's intentionally being rude or maybe verbally aggressive or trying to hurt people's feelings. It's just that he is not able to stop himself from saying something that he thinks or has that impulse, and the loss of that impulse and that filter that he has. And then the apathy, not caring anymore. And again, I want to express it's not because they don't want to care, it's because of what's happening to the brain. All of this stuff is controlled by our brain, and they still want to care about their family and their kids, but they're not able to because it's a symptom of the disease. They can have flat facial expression to where they're not smiling. And this can be because of what's happening in the frontal lobe, but also that motor decline. They're not able to smile. They're not able to use the muscles in their face. They can have be hypochondriac, just that fear, constant fear of living with another illness. And then you might see some memory loss, particularly as the disease progresses into the later stages of the disease, and they're not able to care for themselves anymore. You can also see the impulse control. They're not, so they have a lack of emotional control, but also a lack of that impulse control. So it could be, again, that obsessive compulsive disorder kind of thing that it looks like, but impulse to maybe touch something, say something that they may not want to say, but they can't stop themselves from saying it, or touch something or grab something because that impulse, they're not in control of those impulses, or possibly even their reflexes. If we think back when we were not as in control of our reflexes when we were babies, it can be that same thing. And I have this reflex of somebody startling me, or I grab hold of something and I can't let it go. It's not because I don't want to, it's just I can't right now. Repetition may be saying the same thing over and over again, or doing the same action over and over again. And then what we can see, which is fairly common, is compulsion. And we typically see it in a compulsive eating behavior. So they are just constantly eating and they can't stop themselves from eating. So they can gorge on food. I have known 2 or 3 families that have had to lock down the refrigerator, like physically put locks on it to stop their loved ones, because they can't stop themselves from eating what they are doing. I knew a gentleman that went from a normal weight for a gentleman of his age of 53, I believe, at a 6'5", and he had gained a couple of 100 pounds and up into the 400-pound range of weight because of the compulsive eating that he had. Again, these are symptoms of the disease, not something that they are wanting to do necessarily. And what we also see is they don't have the ability to recognize the changes in themselves. Most of them don't recognize those changes that are happening. They're not aware that they're acting differently, or that they've distanced themselves, or they're not as affectionate with their kids or their wives, or that they've lost their job because of their behaviors or their inability to do what they've always done. And they're not really bothered by it. So it's that lack of self-awareness. They're also not aware of risky behavior. So if they don't see anything wrong with them, then they're not aware that their behaviors can be risky or be very dangerous, actually. So this can be anywhere. In the video mentioned, somebody's not aware that the boiling water or the stove is hot and that they shouldn't touch it. And then they are not understanding why we get mad at them when they go to touch something. It's just that lack of awareness and that lack of risky behavior and what's changing within them and how to navigate their environment. Again, abnormal postures, gait disorders, tremors, clumsiness, which we'll talk to more in depth here in a second. So talking about the causes, and we said some of this is familial. They're not really entirely sure why, but they are seeing about 40% of it as a genetic mutation that happens in persons. So there's a tau gene and a tau protein that builds up in the brain. This mutation causes tangles, those tau proteins to tangle, create masses within the brain. It starts to attack the neurons to where the neurons can't work anymore. They die, and it leads to that shrinkage in the brain. And then there's the PGRN gene. Again, it's another mutation this one leads to a low production of a protein that causes the TDP43 to go awry. And we see an increase or a decrease in the TDP protein in persons that have FTD. And we think it's because, or they think it's because it's a mutation that is not allowing that protein to produce like it should in a normal, healthy brain. And then we'd see the CNORF72 gene. It's a mutation that they find that's most common in the familial cases of that FTD. and FTD with ALS. Again, don't know much about it. They're still trying to work on this. And that last bullet point there are other mutations they find that are more common in persons that have that familial FTD. So we see it in families. We see it more commonly in families with FTD and FTD with ALS. So to reiterate, you have the behavioral variant, the primary progressive aphasia, which is the language variant, and then the motor movement variant, which is the corticobasal syndrome, supranuclear palsy, or the ALS variants. These cause those motor declines in persons with a frontotemporal disorder. So the behavioral variant, again, the most common type, it's about half of all the cases of an FTD diagnosis. You can get this as early as in your 20s. But you can also get it as late in your 80s. It is most commonly between your 40s and young 60s that you see this most commonly diagnosed, but you can get it later in life. And the first symptoms are behavior changes that we've talked about already. The artist I mentioned earlier, and one of the other symptoms of his particular thing was his art. They described it as his art became more flat. As the disease started to take more and more of him, his ability to express and use his talent became flat. And was the best way to describe what they were able to describe how it was taking away those abilities in him, became flat. And that would be something that's uncharacteristic for him. They're not able to recognize, again, that their behaviors are affecting others, and maybe in an offensive way or an inappropriate way. And that emotional flatness or expressive of emotions. So with the artist, he was not able to express himself in his art as well. It became flat. But then you can also see this as people just don't use their emotions. They are not emotionally expressive, whether it's with anger or sadness or happiness or joy, they're just flat. Is common. You can also see people become more angry and go through what you would call an emotional turmoil and maybe manic stages. So it's where they're manic and emotional turmoil, but also depressive symptoms as well. So you have the manic state and the more depressive state. You can see this, which is fairly common in this type of dementia, this variant of this dementia. And then reduced initiative. So they're just not taking initiative to do anything. And that also comes along with a lot of apathy. They just don't care. And again, it's not because they don't want to. It's because it's part of the disease that's causing this. And then the primary progressive aphasia, or that language decline. This can involve in speaking, comprehension, reading, writing, music as well. It's affected. It doesn't really go away, but it is affected. So the three types of primary progressive aphasia that we can see are the semantic, and again, this is just the inability to understand words and meanings behind the words, maybe the inability to recognize objects, recognize people, or recognize faces. They might hear a voice and know the voice, but the face is not recognizable. I read about a lady who said that she was looking in a mirror, washing her hands one day and was just staring in the mirror, wondering who that lady was. And she was looking at herself, but she couldn't recognize the face. It has to do with where the damage is happening in the part of the brain. You also have the progressive non-fluent aphasia. So this is the ability to speak. It's also called Broca's aphasia. So you know that Broca part of our brain that allows us to speak and helps us speak. They're just having much more harder time producing the words. They may know the word they want to say, but they just can't really get it out or speak it. Or as they're talking, they omit words that are supposed to be there or help the sentence actually form and make sense. And then the logopenic primary progressive aphasia. This is having a harder time finding words, but they can understand words. And then the motor decline. So what we see is the corticobasal syndrome, or CBS, and the progressive supranuclear palsy. So the supranuclear palsy will cause symptoms with balance and walking. Typically, they're going to move slowly and have unexplained falls. So you'll just notice that they're going to just start moving slower. Maybe their posture is going to be changed. They might be stiff in their body. And it can look like maybe similar to Parkinson's, to where they don't move their arms when they walk. So you got that stiffness, they're moving slower. And then of course, that's just going to increase their falls because their gait is really off. They can have a fixed stare or that flat facial expression. And then trouble with eye movement, which is also going to play into this motor decline. If I'm not able to move my eyes to where I'm seeing where my feet are going or seeing what's in front of me, again, because I can't move my eyes, it's a muscle thing too, a motor decline in the muscles and being able to move the eye muscles. That's going to start to, it'll be a first symptom for this, but also increase my falls. And then the corticobasal syndrome. This is the inability to control movement. And it usually is, it starts with the limbs, the arms and the legs. It's typically you might fear it or see it happen on one side of the body first, but then eventually both sides are going to be affected. But it's just where everything becomes really uncoordinated. They can't control the movements, or they become very stiff. And if I'm very stiff, it's because I can't control my movement. I can't get my arm to move, right? Or it might be moving in a jerking manner and I'm not able to control that. Or if I go to move my arm, it might jerk instead, or a tremor as well. They can also have a hard time with the motor skills is a common thing for the CBS. It's being able to use these manipulators, these fine fingers right here. And this can be opening up a small bucket. It can be buttoning things up. It can be using writing utensils, eating utensils. It's those fine motor skills that start to disappear pretty early on. And also having a harder time swallowing. And then you see the frontotemporal dementia with Parkinson's. Again, you're going to start seeing some behavioral changes and maybe language changes depending on which area of the brain it gets first, along with the Parkinsonian movement disorders. So again, that can be a stiff upper body. It can be posture changes, and it can be tremors as well, or they're real rigid in their movements, kind of cogwheel movements. And then the FTD with the ALS. And the ALS is the muscle neuron disease, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. And the FTD with ALS is really a combination of both of those. So you got FTD and ALS. So you're going to see the changes in behavior and or language, but you're also going to see that muscle weakness, jerks and wigglings in muscles. So as the muscle deteriorates, and that can cause uncontrolled movements within the muscles, and then the weakness, you're also seeing the changes in the behaviors and or changes in the language. So to diagnose this, again, I said it's hard to diagnose it first because typically we're not looking for a dementia or a type of frontotemporal disorder, but an evaluation from a doctor, of course, can be a geriatrician, it can be a neurologist, it can be a psychologist, a neuropsychologist, a psychiatrist, but it does come out as a ruling out process, just like it is for every other dementia. We want to do a neurological exam, brain scans of some sort, and this can be MRIs, it can be CT scans, it can be PET scans or the SPEC scans that are helpful because they help measure the blood flow in the brain. They help measure the glucose in the brain. So what part of the brain is using the glucose or is the blood flow getting up there? And then oxygen use in the brain as well. So if remembering back to the picture I showed earlier, if there's darker spots on that, then that means the brain's not using the glucose, or the blood flow is not getting up there because that part of the brain's not needing it, or it's not using it there anymore because the damage has already happened, and you already have that shrinkage and loss of the brain in those areas. Of course, you can do a complete record of the person's symptoms, get family history, medical history, blood tests, because they want to rule out a bunch of other things, genetic testing if appropriate and if needed, and then neuropsychological testing as well. And then the treatment and the management of this. It's about managing symptoms. We're not able to cure it or slow the progression, but we can manage the symptoms and help them do better for a longer period of time. But also, how can we create that quality of life as the disease changes? And this has to start with the support team. You have a good team around you. They have a good team around them to help everybody do well living with this disease. And this is doctors, nurses, social workers. Therapy is going to be very important. So speech, occupational, and physical therapy for any variant of this disease. Case managers, pharmacists, neighbors, you name it, other family members that's going to help support the treatment and the management of this disease. And of course, education, staying connected to people in the field, staying connected through support groups and other families and persons impacted by this disease is crucial to helping everybody manage well and live well with the disease. We'll talk about managing some behaviors and medications, but also how to help with the language and motor movements as well. But how we manage and treat this disease is using the same non-pharmacological approaches we do for the other types of dementia. So it's not arguing, it's meeting them where they're at and working with the abilities they have in each moment. So not reasoning or arguing with them, being sensitive if you can. If we need to stop and take a break, if it's getting too argumentative or too agitated, then it's okay to stop and take a break and, calm down and then come back to it. And also understanding the communication is changing and what steps can we put in place to help with that communication. Keeping a routine is going to be huge as best you can with this, and then we'll talk about medications. But really trying to accept rather than challenge somebody with those behavioral symptoms. Again, arguing or reasoning or telling them that they're wrong, it's not going to help because they may not be really aware of what they're doing. Again, they may not necessarily care what they're doing, and that's a symptom of the disease, because they're not able to control those behaviors or those lack of impulses or compulsive behavior or whatever it may be. Instead, just being as sensitive as possible and understand that this is the illness talking or this is the illness behaving. And for us to get as care partners, be able to take that time out that I mentioned, take a deep breath. It's okay when we're frustrated, as long as they're safe and we're safe. We all kind of do better when we have a timeout. As long as everybody's safe, right? So if there are safety concerns, we want to go ahead and eliminate those as possible choices. So if there are firearms in the house or medications that could possibly get to, we want to make sure that those safety barriers are put in place so those don't become a concern down the road. The car keys are not there, the car is not there, whatever it may be. Let's go ahead and eliminate that to help them be successful and help you be successful. Dealing with apathy, limiting choices, offer specific options. Instead of saying, hey, what do you want to eat? Just say, we're either having chicken or beef tonight. Which one are you going for? And that way, they may be able to answer. They might be able to give you their choice instead of saying, I don't care, or I'm not eating, whatever it is. In that routine, a routine just really helps everybody feel secure. There's a security in a familiar routine. Reduce distractions as best we can, and using the environment to help them be successful. It can be anywhere from it's a familiar environment, it's a comfortable, it's a friendly environment, and it's a functional environment for they're able to use their environment to the best of their abilities, but also not making too overstimulating or dangerous. Again, making sure there are safety precautions in place. If compulsive eating is an issue, again, you can supervise their eating, you can limit food choices, you can lock things up. That's been the best way I've seen that done. I've also heard families, we've locked up the refrigerator, but they just went down the street to 7-Eleven and got food anyway. So it's kind of thinking about, all right, we've done this. And if they start going down to 7-Eleven to get the food anyway, what's the next thing that we can do? Can we distract them with an activity? Can we have them come with us and do this? Can there be something like suckers or something that they can have in their mouth and in their hand to help with that compulsive behavior, as opposed to just eating all the time, if possible? You can also talk to the doctor about potential medications for that for a period of time. And you will need to arrange care options for professionals for safety issues, but also just self-care issues too. And antidepressants do work well, and they're commonly prescribed for this disease. They can help with the social disinhibitions or the social lack of social filters that can happen. And it can also help with that impulsive behavior and compulsive behavior. If there is aggression or physical aggression or anger that is uncontrolled, there are some, or delusions, there are some antipsychotics that somebody can go on for a short period of time to help them manage those symptoms of the disease. You also want to be very in constant talks with the doctor if you're using those types of medications, just being a good advocate, watching for potential side effects, and then making sure that they're safe on those medications. For those that have the primary progressive aphasia issues, you'll want to tailor the treatment to their specific, whether it's a semantic dementia or that non-fluent aphasia, but knowing that their language difficulties will decline over time. But some things that can help is a communication notebook. And there's a photo album or stuff, or a page or a notebook that's labeled with pictures instead of words. So I can point to a picture and say, this is, let's say it's a menu. And instead of just having words on the menu, it's pictures. And I can point at the picture and I'm still able to communicate with you using pictures. Drawing, gestures, acting things out. You can store lists or words or just short phrases in a computer or a phone for them to point to as well. It may not be a long paragraph, but it's, a short phrase here and there. Speak slowly, speak clearly, use simple sentences, and allowing enough time for their responses. I watched several videos of somebody might lose their train of thought or lose the words that they're going to use, and they'll turn to their care partner and say, help me. And so they're asking, I'm doing the best I can, but I need your help at this particular moment. And that works well. And then speech language therapists can help. And they can also help determine, maybe maintain where somebody's at for a longer period of time, but determine the best tools to use to help everybody communicate better during those times. And then medications, and then for physical and occupational therapy, particularly for the motor decline in the FDD. Parkinson's disease medications can offer some help and some improvement in somebody that has the corticobasal syndrome. We really want to have physical and occupational therapy in there. Speech therapy can help manage some of the language symptoms that might come along with the motor movement decline. Again, motor movement with speech, I'm having to use my jaw and my tongue, those are all muscles, so those can be affected too. The Parkinson's, again, medications can help with the stiffness, the slowness, the balance exercise or the balance problems, but exercises, physical therapy, but just staying moving, doing strength training, doing exercises that are helpful for persons with Parkinson's disease, making sure that they're steady on their feet as best we can, but then starting to incorporate walkers or canes as needed, as they're going to start needing those to help maintain their balance and reduce potential falls. And then antidepressants have shown to help with modest success, even with the motor decline, but of course the other ones as well. And in conclusion, and a few resources, there is the Association for the Frontotemporal Degeneration, and they have a lot of information on their website. They have a lot of education. They have a lot of different support groups that are online that you can connect with, and talking with experts in this particular dementia, but also talking with families that are living with it, and being able to share your stories and share your experiences and brainstorm and walk through this, because you don't have to do it alone, for sure. Most people with a frontotemporal disorder are able to qualify for Social Security disability. If that's something that you haven't looked into or want to look into, there's a phone number there. The 800-772-1213 number can help you see if you qualify and start you on that process to getting approved, if that is where you might be at. And getting early diagnosis, an accurate diagnosis is important if we can, and help starting to get that support team put in place is crucial. And this is our information. We are always here to help you guys brainstorm, help connect y'all to other resources, or answer questions that you just may have about potential treatment options, or, mom's doing X, Y, or Z, and I'm not sure I know how to respond. Well, we're here not just through our education program, but we can talk over the phone, meet one-on-one, and just chat and help you. That's what we're here for. We're here to help you through the journey. In several ways that we can. There are residential and respite care, our day program, and then of course there are education and support programs too. Our support groups, we have 3 that meet, 2 that meet once a week, and 1 that meets once a month, and they're facilitated by a licensed counselor, Holly Glover, and really can help. And it is, I sit on them as much as I possibly can. Just to be able, you get the education part of it, but you get that support and knowing that I'm not alone, and getting to share experiences and sharing what worked and what didn't work, and being able to laugh and cry with people that truly understand what you're going through. So I'm going to stop sharing. Thank y'all for being with me. I see one chat. So a question in chat, what is the difference between tau and amyloid, or is it the same thing? The tau protein and the amyloid protein are 2 different proteins that are in the brain. And from my understanding of it, the tau protein is typically more inside of the neuron, and the amyloid protein is on the outside of the neurons. So what happens to these proteins, and this is what we don't know, is they get cut off from cell walls improperly. They start to misfold, they start to clump together, and those clumps become toxic to the neurons. So with the tau, it's attacking from the inside of the neuron, and the amyloid is attacking from the outside of the neuron. I hope that clears it up, and that's just my understanding of how those 2 are different and how they work and how they become toxic in the brains of people. Are there any other questions or anything anybody wants to share?
Well, you didn't say very much about Louis' body. I was wondering if you could maybe expound on that.
Yeah, Lewy body dementia, this is a different type of dementia that, so the Lewy bodies, those are another type of protein coined by Dr. Lewy, who found them. Those proteins develop on the cortex, or the outer layer of the brain. So you see different symptoms because that part of the brain is going to be attacked. So what you do see is the outer layer, but it also develops in the brainstem of the brain. So it can look like Parkinson's disease. So because that's the brainstem, and where that happens is also where Parkinson's disease starts. So you can see some Parkinsonian movement disorders, but you can also see brain changes that happen because the cortex of the brain is being affected. And that looks more like somebody might have hallucinations. They might have more sleep issues. So they're acting out their dreams, or they have more nightmares, or they don't distinguish between a nightmare and reality. They have a hard time with that. And then their level of alertness and functioning fluctuates a lot more from day to day. So they might be doing just fine in the morning, but after lunch, their confusion and level of alertness and abilities have dropped dramatically, which is different. So, and you might not also you typically don't see a lot of short-term memory loss issues early on. But this is also a progressive dementia that eventually you will start to see other symptoms like memory loss, language changes, judgment changes, different things like that. Yeah. And we did a full program on Lewy body dementia a few weeks ago, and that is downloaded on our YouTube channel. So you can go to YouTube, Google the James L. West Center, and there's a bunch of our programs are downloaded on there for y'all to access at any time. But that one, there's a specific one to Lewy body dementia.
Oh, what is it called? It's a YouTube.
It's a YouTube channel, and just Google the James L. West Center. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So another question is, people with FTD can qualify for Social Security disability. Do you know if there are additional Social Security benefits if the individuals are receiving Social Security based on age? I am not personally aware of additional benefits. What I would do is I would call the Area Agency on Aging of Tarrant County, and they have a benefits counselor that's free. They would be one of my first choices. I mean, personally, that's who I would call first to say, ooh, here's what I'm living with. Here's what the benefits we already have. What else could I possibly take advantage of? Or what I could possibly qualify for, because they're the experts in that. So again, it's the Area Agency on Aging of Tarrant County, or whatever county you live in. There are area agencies of aging in the counties, and you can just call those and ask, I need to talk to a benefits counselor, and go from there. Or you can call the Alzheimer's Association, and they can probably point you in the right direction as well to somebody to talk to about those.
Is there any way I could get a continuing education for this?
For this particular program, we are not offering continuing education, but
Okay.
we do have several programs coming up where we are offering
Okay.
continuing education, and I'll make sure that y'all get that information on the follow-up email. It'll specify, excuse me, which programs we are offering credit for and which ones we are not able to. So,
You know, I'm having trouble seeing behind you. Would you give me the name of that place again?
yeah, it's the James L. West Center for Dementia Care.
Okay.
Mhm. And in our follow-up email, you'll have all the contact information
that's right.
and all
Okay.
that stuff too. So,
Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. Are there any other questions or anything anybody wants to share? All right, well, I appreciate your time and attention. Look for that email this afternoon, and please don't hesitate to share these resources, but don't hesitate to reach out with any questions you may have or anything else that comes up. That's what we're here for.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.